worship you for the privilege of being with these students and faculty members. And I know this is one evening quickly upon us and quickly it will pass. But I pray that somehow something would happen this evening that would remain memorable to us. Maybe we won't remember the night, but that the ideas will still be reverberating in our minds and hearts. And for that to happen, we need you to be central to the process. I know that what I'm offering these people are just crumbs. And yet your son once received crumbs, not much more than that, 5 loaves and 2 fish from Andrew. 5,000 needed to be fed. And he blessed those crumbs and broke them and multiplied them, and everybody was satisfied. I know everybody here this evening has different challenges on his or her heart. Fears, hopes, aspirations, ambiguity, perplexity. I pray that each person would hear something unique to their experience from the voice of one man. That's impossible if you're not involved in the transaction. So please take and let your Holy Spirit bless these crumbs and divide them and multiply them, that everybody might leave satisfied. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen. Amen. I want to give a little background on Lewis first, my own background. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles. I used to take a gun to school when I was in high school. It was absolutely stupid. My frontal lobe had not been fully developed yet. And I went to college for no academic reason whatsoever. You have to take this completely by faith. But back in those days, I was an athlete. I came to faith during that time, and I got interested in telling my friends that they were loved by God and forgiven. I don't know anybody who's been touched by the love of God who wouldn't have something like that on their lips and want to share it with others. My friends asked questions. I had no clue what the answers were to the questions, but they were good ones. And I said, if that's the only thing keeping you from faith, I won't leave a stone unturned. And I would dig for answers, and this name kept cropping up. It actually happened when my older sister told me about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. She was a 5th grade teacher, and she was reading them to her children. And I read through the Narnia Chronicles. I was fascinated. But then I wanted to find out about Lewis. So I read his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, and that was the book that hooked me. Because Lewis talked about these deep longings and the quest to find the object of the longings. I knew the longings. Yeah. He gave me a vocabulary for my soul. And I not only started reading Lewis, I started reading the books he referred to, because he opens more than wardrobe doors. And I got a liberal arts education from reading Lewis and the books that he refers to. I'm probably the only PE major in the world who is actually familiar with the Fairy Queen, and In Praise of Poesy by Philip Sidney, and Astrophil and Stella, and Chaucer's Troilus and Cressida, and The Romance of the Rose. And I love these books, and Dante and Milton and so on. But the thing is, though, with Lewis, interestingly enough, while I was reading him and got this background, I got ready to graduate from college. I was reading voraciously, and a man wisely said to me, "You don't get an education in college." I thought, man, why was I paying all that tuition? He said, no, you lay a foundation for an education. And what do we call the graduation exercises? Commencement. You will now commence your education by building on that foundation. How many people leave college and don't read another book? What a sad story that is. Their education is a tragedy. And consequently, he said, pick an author who will take you places and make him your life study. I think he could have said a composer, an artist, a period of history, a country, but I picked Lewis. I think I could have done worse. And I just started reading him and reading the books he referred to and so on. But I ended up going on to seminary, doing my master's. Later I did my doctorate, wrote both dissertations on C.S. Lewis. When I did my master's, I had to write a thesis, and there's just no way I was going to write it on the use of the optative mood in the Greek text of Philemon. It just wasn't going to hold me. But I could write it on Lewis, and all of a sudden I started putting pen to paper with Lewis, and that started the writing side. I think I've got like 6 books out on him now, something like that. And the thing that's interesting to me is, even so, with all this interest in Lewis, it is not about Lewis, even tonight. Lewis is interesting, but the way I can put it in context for you is this. When we grew up in LA, we were poor. And I would see kids go to the cafeteria, and I always wondered, what was that experience like? I wanted to go desperately. But it cost 31 cents, and for us that was prohibitive. My mother always had a brown bag lunch. There was a sandwich, a cookie, and a piece of fruit. But one day, to my complete surprise, she handed me the 31 cents, and I was going to get to eat in the cafeteria that day. I was nervous. I kept reaching down in my pocket just to make sure that that money didn't fall out of my pocket. And I get to the cafeteria, and then I'm nervous in a new way. I couldn't have explained it this way then, but these were my exact sentiments. Unfamiliar with the sociological protocols of elementary school cafeteria life, would I do something stupid and the other kids make fun of me? So I watched with intensity the girl in front of me. She grabbed, paid the woman at the register. I did that and was relieved to have that off my chest. She grabbed the fiberglass tray. I did the same. She put her cutlery on the tray and moved that tray to that chrome roll bar counter. Remember that thing? And she came to the first thing on the menu. It was string beans. I hated string beans. Oh, no. I just thought this cafeteria life isn't all it was cracked up to be. Apparently the girl didn't like it either, but she said to the cafeteria lady, "I'll have a small portion of those, please." I had never heard the word before, but I watched the magic. Cafeteria lady grabbed a really small bowl. Do you remember that cafeteria lady, by the way? She was kind of heavy set. She wore a white outfit. She had her hair net, and she had an apron with a bunch of smudge marks on it. She was the ubiquitous cafeteria lady that worked in every elementary school cafeteria in America. She grabbed a little bowl, took a big spoon with holes in it, dug down into this pot, and put 3 string beans in the bowl and handed it to the girl. And I thought, wow, that's good. I'll have a small portion of those too, please. I use the word. I go on down the line, I put the different things on my tray, and when I got to the end, what was at the end of the cafeteria line? Desserts. I saw the most economically cut pieces of chocolate cake I'd ever seen in my life. And I wondered if the word had other applications. So I said to the cafeteria lady, "I'll have a large portion of that, please." And she cut me the biggest piece of chocolate cake I'd ever seen up to that time in my life, and I thought, that's a good word. And the psalmist used it. He said, "Whom have I in heaven but thee, and besides thee I desire nothing on earth. My heart and my flesh may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." If you want a large portion of Lewis, I hope you leave disappointed. But if you want to use Lewis as a lens to see something more important, then I hope you leave satisfied. Lewis said in a very obscure book that he wrote called The Personal Heresy, that we do not read a book in order to focus on the author. We don't make a spectacle of the author. We use the author as spectacles to see the world that the author is describing or depicting. And Lewis said, "I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." He was a person, just like you're trying to get, a person who sought to integrate faith in the whole learning process. And in light of that, then we start to think about Lewis as a writer of fiction. You all know, I'm sure, that one of his best friends was J.R.R. Tolkien. And they would write their books and read them to each other as they wrote. And so I'll string in a little Tolkien tonight as well as maybe a little G.K. Chesterton and some of that same literary set, if it's okay. But let me first answer the question, why did Lewis use fiction in the first place? There's a myth about that basically Lewis was in a debate at Oxford University. He was the president of a group called the Socratic Club, where one week during term, a non-Christian or a skeptic might read a paper, and the Christians would respond. The next week, a Christian would read a paper, and the skeptics would respond. And 8 weeks of term, 3 terms during the school year, this would go on for 24 weeks of the year. Lewis was the president of the Oxford Socratic Club. On February 2nd, 1948, supposedly he was in a debate with Elizabeth Anscombe, and if you read what some people have said about it, Anscombe, the philosopher, destroyed Lewis in the debate, and consequently Lewis went into fiction, and he didn't write any more apologetics after that. You can read this in Humphrey Carpenter's The Inklings, George Sayre's Jack, Peter Skakel's Reason and Imagination, and C.S. Lewis, and A.N. Wilson's C.S. Lewis, a biography. It's probably the worst biography ever written on Lewis, but it goes down smoothly. I wish I could write like A.N. Wilson. 4 people all repeat it. Now, if you repeat an error 4 times, then all of a sudden it becomes truth, right? But what is the reality? Well, number one, George Sher in his book Jack said he talked to Lewis 2 weeks later after the debate, and he said, Anscombe destroyed all my arguments for God's existence. It's just not true. How do I know? Anscombe herself published the paper that she read in her collected papers, the 2 volumes, at the end of her career. They didn't argue about God's existence. Matter of fact, Anscombe was herself a Christian. Matter of fact, Anscombe had a hand in Wittgenstein coming to faith at the end of his life, Cambridge University. It's very interesting. No, they argued about the issue of the word valid and whether or not a materialist could make a valid argument. Anscombe herself thought materialism was not a supportable position, but she thought a materialist could still begin with a proposition through a series of inferences, come to some conclusion that would be fair-minded. She didn't believe they could support their materialism accurately. Lewis is arguing that the materialist position is wrong, and they debated like this. Was it a big deal? Well, my doctoral supervisor, Basil Mitchell, who was a philosopher at Oxford University, was there. He was the vice president of the Socratic Club, and he said, no, there were no fireworks at all in that room. Not only that, years later, when Lewis went to Cambridge, Mitchell became the president of the Socratic Club. After Lewis died, there had been some scuttlebutt about this debate. He said, I don't remember anything about it. They brought Anscombe back and John Lucas, the Oxford philosopher, and they debated, and Mitchell said, hands down, Lucas won that debate. The point is, Lucas, of course, would have mediated it through his own philosophical grid, so it wouldn't have been exactly like Lewis, but nevertheless, hardly the kind of thing that we would suggest gives credence to those who would say Lewis turned to fiction because he is a failed apologist. Furthermore, Lewis wrote 36 essays in apologetics before the debate. He wrote 34 essays in apologetics after the debate. Almost half the essays. Matter of fact, the essays that he wrote after the debate, many of them comprise huge parts of the apologetic work God in the Dock, Christian Reflections, and also Present Concerns. Doesn't sound like a person who fell apart because of this particular debate. Furthermore, Lewis's first apologetic book was actually a work of fiction. A year after he became a Christian, in 3 weeks in Belfast, Ireland, he wrote his first Christian book. It's the only allegory he ever wrote, and it's called The Pilgrim's Regress, an allegorical apology for Christianity, reason, and romanticism. Lewis said in a book he wrote called The Arthurian Torso that he thought the first problem in life is how do you put the stone in the shell? It's an image that was borrowed from Wordsworth's The Prelude. The stone represents reason. The shell represents the longings of the heart. How do you fit stone and shell, head and heart together? What will enable us to do that? And he felt Christianity would do it, and he tries to depict it in this particular allegory. The interesting thing to me about this as well is that as Lewis writes this particular book, he is trying to draw others in to the realization that sin, by its very nature, estranges us. If sin is man playing God of his own life, and virtually all the definitions of it in the New Testament and Old Testament would say it's man playing God of his own life, that's going to estrange us from God. Not only that, it's going to estrange us from one another. It's going to make us anarchists. Anarchists make bad community people. But it also estranges us from ourselves. It separates head and heart. It separates soul and spirit from flesh. And we become divided creatures. And the gospel reconciles us to God, reconciles us to one another, and reconciles us even to ourselves. And Lewis was writing about this in this first of his apologetic work, but he's trying to depict these things there. First off, Lewis too, or going beyond that, Lewis wrote, when a man writes a love sonnet, he not only loves his beloved, he also loves the sonnet. He picks a literary form that helps him say what he wants to say. He put together an essay, and he said, sometimes fairy stories say best what needs to be said. And after the publication of his first science fiction novel, Out of the Silent Planet, he wrote to a friend, I've now discovered that any amount of theology can be smuggled into people's minds under the guise of romance. And he wrote this book before he ever wrote his first popular apologetic book, The Problem of Pain. Lewis knew exactly what he was doing. And I want to suggest to you that he said, an author selects his literary form as a sculptor selects his marble. Fiction was always a tool in his rhetorical toolbox. It wasn't the result of a failed apologist. And so he has specific things he wants to do. Lewis wrote to a friend that the imaginative man in me is older and more continuously operating than the rational man. I enjoy writing fiction with almost anyone. Now let's take it a step further. If I asked you what the word definition means, what would you say? Literally, it means of the finite, of that which has ends. We define a thing because it's small enough that we can wrap words around it and characterize it as something different from other things. So I can talk about the pen versus the person versus the shoes versus the desk versus the lights, whatever. Okay, if definition means of the finite, we define things by their limitations, small enough I can wrap words around it and distinguish it from other things, and their function. How do you define God if he's infinite? When Jesus was confronted with the problem, what did he do? He said the kingdom of heaven is like. He used simile. He used metaphors. He used figures of speech. He used parables. He used story. Lewis was well aware that this is the way that we can set some things forth, especially when we talk about God. The medieval scholastic philosophers and theologians talked about the way of analogy as a way, an important way, of speaking about God, so we can depict him and begin to grasp him. We maybe can't define him because he's infinite, but we can taste and see what he's like. And good story helps us do that. George MacDonald, in his work Annals of a Quiet Neighborhood, MacDonald was an author. Lewis said he never wrote a book where he didn't quote from him either directly or borrow a thought from him. George MacDonald in Annals of a Quiet Neighborhood said, "We do not have souls. We are souls. We have bodies." You tell a child he has a soul, he thinks when he dies, he goes to the grave and his soul goes off someplace else. But no, tell a child he is a soul, when he dies, he goes off someplace, goes to heaven, and he leaves his body behind like clipped hair on the barbershop floor for those of you that still use barbers. I'm bald, so I even say to the barber, why do I have to pay the same amount as that guy over there? One smart aleck barber said, it's finder's fee, we got to find it before we can clip it. But what makes up the soul, people? I think I can set forth proofs for the existence of the soul. I've read tons of books on this sort of thing. But the thing that we've said traditionally is that the soul is that immaterial part of what it is to be human. And it has a thinking part, the reason, a feeling part, the emotion, a choosing part, the volition. Coming from an academic environment, I want to confess to you, hands down, reason is the weakest of those three functions. If I make a bad decision, my reason generally doesn't kick in and say, boy, Jerry, that is really stupid. And if you continue down that line, you're just going to hurt yourself and you're going to hurt other people. No, my reason being weak is marshaled by my will to make all kinds of excuses and rationalizations for that bad choice. Aristotle had a term for it in the Nicomachean Ethics. He called it acrasia or acrasia. It's when we suppress the truth, we deny its weight upon us, and rationalize it to the degree of moral blindness. When I'm hurt emotionally, does my reason kick in and say, boy, Jerry, you need to grieve what that person did to you and forgive them lest you become bitter? Remember Anne Lamott in her book, Traveling Mercy, says bitterness is like you drinking the rat poison and then waiting for the rat to die. Mm-hmm. So we could have somebody who hurt us years before, they may be dead and buried, but we've given them full control of our life because we haven't gotten past the bitterness. Mm-hmm. But reason will come and suppress that emotion and keep it smoldering beneath the surface, and we'll be coming from that place not even realizing what's going on. Reason is weak. Rather than telling us grieve what happened and forgive the person so you can untether from it. And so consequently, Lewis says reason stands before the heart like dragon sentries guarding what will get to that heart. How do you get past the watchful dragon? And sometimes it's not going to be from a well-crafted, rational argument. Lewis says sometimes story gets past the Watchful Dragon. Any of us who have read the scriptures know exactly that this is so. We see it in the example of Nathan, who has to go confront David for his adultery and his murder. We see it with Jesus, who is talking to people who have ears but they can't hear, eyes but they can't see, and he uses story, as Nathan used story when he talked to David. And so consequently, Lewis and Tolkien both sought to awaken desire in the hearts of their readers, to get through to their heart. And they found that sometimes one of the best ways they could do this is to awaken desire through fantasy, and to write of particular worlds, fantasy worlds, that a person might so fall in love with that world and come to long for another world. Now, Lewis talks about it this way. He says that the mark of a literary person is that they read a book more than once. And the unliterary only read books once. I don't want any of you to beat yourself up. At Wheaton College, we have Lewis's library. We have all his marginalia. You can come see it. We have the desk Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings on, and the wardrobe Lewis's grandfather built that he played in when he was a boy. If you go down to the stacks and you go to his library, I can pull out Don Juan by Lord Byron, and I can take you to the last page, and right on the last page, Lewis writes the date when he finished reading that book, and right underneath it he writes, "Never again." Lewis thought at least one book wasn't worth reading more than once. But what did he mean, the literary read books more than once? I bet we've got some literary people in here. How many of you have read any of the Narnian books more than once? Oh, you literary people, you. How many of you read Tolkien, any of his books, Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, more than once? Look at you guys. You should be proud of them. These are read people. How about any Jane Austen books more than once? Pride and Prejudice, Emma, Northanger Abbey, okay? How many of you have read Where the Red Fern Grows more than once? Harry Potter more than once? Oh my word, you literary people, you. What is Lewis saying about this? What happens with children? They hear a great bedtime story. And what do they say right after they hear it? Again. Read it again. It's not just always to keep the lights on a little bit longer. And Lewis says, why do children do this? Because they've encountered a world, and even though they know all the twists and turns of plot of that story, they so love the world, they want to go back to that other world because it awakens in them a longing for the only other world they could ever really know, which Lewis says is heaven. Now, when Lewis and Tolkien turn their attention to the why of story, we find two preliminary elements in Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, the essay that Lewis said was the best thing he ever read on story, and four elements in story besides those preliminary bits. I want to look at those six things. So Tolkien gave a lecture right after The Hobbit came out at St. Andrews University, the Andrew Lang Memorial Lectures. When Lewis was putting together a festschrift for his friend Charles Williams, and then Williams dies while they're putting together this festschrift, Tolkien submitted this particular essay to the collection. And he says that the origins of fairy stories are as old as language itself. And the stories are engaged in the art of embellishment. Do you guys remember when you were little and you ever heard the story Stone Soup when you were kids?
Yes.
So soldiers are coming back from their military duty. A little village knows that the soldiers in those days could just come to a village and say, you need to billet us for the evening, feed us, and give us a place to sleep. These villagers are having their time in the village square, and some kids come running in. The soldiers are coming down the path, and they're going to want a place to stay. All the villagers pack up and go in their rooms and pull the shutters closed. Soldiers arrive, everybody's gone, but they've been through this before, and they have a little plan. One of the guys says, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. Hey, George, why don't you make that stone soup that you made for us last night? The villagers are there listening from their closed shutters, and they peek out. Stone soup, what's that? If we could do that, we won't have to plow, we won't have to plant, we won't have to weed. We will be fine. No harvesting. And so they go get water from the river, They find a pot, they get a fire going, they got the water rolling, boiling, and all of a sudden George reaches in, pulls out a velvet envelope from his inside pocket of his coat, takes out the stone, takes a whiff of it and drops it in the pot, and they all look down. And all the villagers are looking out. And all of a sudden one of the soldiers says, oh, last night it was so good when it had some onions in it. Boom, I got onions! The villager comes running down, they cut those onions up and put it in there, and he's looking in the pot. Another one of the soldiers says, oh, it was great when it had some potatoes. Boom, they come down, there's potatoes, ox meat, they've got ox meat, they've got carrots. Pretty soon, it's not stone soup anymore. It's stone stew. All the villagers are there. They start stringing lanterns. The musicians come out and play. They have a big festival. By the time dinner's over, they fight over who gets to host one of the soldiers. And George reaches down and he grabs that stone and cleans it off and puts it in that velvet envelope because he might need it on another night. And Tolkien says stories like that. Every generation adds new things to the recipe. And stories grow. And Lewis says the key of medieval stories was the idea of embellishment. And we do it today. Let me tell you, where does this come from? West Side Story, what is it? The retelling of what? Romeo and Juliet. How about Bridget Jones' Diary? Pride and Prejudice. As a matter of fact, Colin Firth plays Darcy in both films. And he's called Darcy, like the director's hitting us over the head with a 2x4. I hope you get it. This is Pride and Prejudice retold. Oh, brother, where art thou? The Odyssey. August Rush. It's Oliver Twist. And Robin Williams plays the Fagin character. Clueless is Emma. Inception. It's the retelling of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. The Lion King. The retelling of Hamlet. Lewis himself does it. Prince Caspian is a retelling of Hamlet. The Great Divorce is a depiction, a satirical depiction of Dante's Divine Comedy. Till We Have Faces, a retelling of the story of Cupid and Psyche. Stories embellish, they retell, etc., etc. Okay, so Tolkien first says there's this feature of the story that's ongoing, and it emphasizes the fact that we as humans are made in the image of a creator. We are sub-creators. And then Tolkien goes on to write about the great mythical significance of prohibition that comes through in the story. G.K. Chesterton calls it the doctrine of conditional joy, that all joy comes on condition. Here's how Chesterton wrote of it. It's a wonderful piece from his essay on fairy stories. If you really read the fairy tales, you'll observe that one idea runs from one end of them to the other. The idea that peace and happiness can only exist on some condition. This idea, which is the core of ethics, is the core of the nursery tales. The whole happiness of fairyland hangs upon one thread. Cinderella may have a dress woven on supernatural looms and blazing with unearthly brilliance, but she must be back when the clock strikes 12. The king may invite fairies to the christening, but he must invite all the fairies, or frightful results will follow. Bluebeard's wife may open all the doors but one. A promise is broken to a cat and the whole world goes wrong. A promise is broken to a yellow dwarf and the whole world goes wrong. A girl may be the bride of the god of love himself, but she never tries to see him. She sees him and he vanishes away. There's Cupid and Psyche again. A girl is given a box on condition she does not open it. She opens it and all the world's evils of the world rush out in her. What is that? Pandora. What was left in the box? Hope. Hope. Always hope. Always hope. A man and a woman are put in a garden on condition they do not eat one fruit. They eat it and they lose their joy in all the fruits of the earth. Does it start to sound familiar? Oh. This great idea, Chesterton says, then, is the backbone of all folklore. The idea that all happiness hangs on one thin veto. All positive joy depends on one negative. Now, it is obvious that there are many philosophical and religious ideas akin to or symbolized by this. But it is not with them I wish to deal here. It is surely obvious that all ethics ought to be taught to this fairy tale tune, that if one does the thing forbidden, one imperils the thing provided. A man who breaks his promise to his wife ought to be reminded that even if she's a cat, the case of the fairy cat shows that such conduct may be incautious. A burglar just about to open someone else's safe should be playfully reminded that he's in the perilous posture of the beautiful Pandora. He's about to lift the forbidden lid and loosen evils unknown. The boy eating someone's apples in someone's apple tree should be a reminder that he has come to a mystical moment of his life when one apple may rob him of all others. This is a profound morality of fairy tales, which so far from being lawless goes to the root of all law. Instead of finding, like common books of ethics, a rationalistic basis for each commandment, they find the great mystical basis for all commandments. And in the fairyland, we see what the command is. And we see that if the command is violated, joys are lost. But if the command is kept, joys are flush and full. So the command is like a fence. And we go to the edge of the fence and we look out at what we can't get to, and we don't realize the fence is to protect us from those things. And we pine longing for what's outside the fence, rather than turning our backs to the fence and see the playground that's defined and provided. And I think Tolkien is recognizing that Chesterton's got it right. And this is one of the great functions of fairy stories. I remember I became a Christian when I was a freshman in college. And after a year of being a Christian, I prayed this foolish prayer. It was, Lord, discipline me. Lord, discipline me. The next 3 months of fall were the worst months of my life up to that time. It seemed like everybody I knew saw some flaw in me and decided it was their duty to come and tell me. Probably because Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living, and if we're not examining our life, all of those around us will be happy to do it for us. I have never prayed that prayer since. I prayed instead, Lord, keep me from a stiff neck, give me a soft heart, and teach me vicariously through the mistakes of others so I won't have to. And the thing is, the fairy stories show us that. We see the consequences of those who fail. We see the joys of those who do well. We all grope towards the happy ending, you see, where they lived happily ever after. And the story provides that. Well, anyway, with this concept then of language and embellishment and sub-creativity, and we see also with this preliminary of the benefits of prohibition in fairy stories, we now move to 4 elements that Tolkien says are central to this as a literary form. And the first is fantasy. And fantasy is awakening desire for another world. Ultimately, for Lewis and Tolkien, awakening desire for heaven. So Tolkien's book, The Hobbit, he didn't want to name it The Hobbit. His title for it was There and Back Again. Publisher wanted it called The Hobbit. And Tolkien pushed to make sure There and Back Again at least stayed in the subtitle. And you know how the book goes, right? In the bottom of a hole there lived a hobbit. And this meant comfort. It wasn't a hole with oozy bits of words coming out. Did you guys ever dig holes when you were kids? We were going to go to China. Yes. We dug between the garage of the Estises and our house. And Roger Estes was our friend, and we dug down probably about 8 feet, and then we started digging under the Estes' garage. Why did it not cave in on us? But any child lives to adulthood is a testimony of the utter grace of God. But those holes always had oozy bits of worms, not a hobbit hole. It meant comfort. And hobbits are perfectly suited for travel. They've got great constitutions. They got leathery bottom feet. They don't need shoes covered with hair on the top. And yet, hobbits don't like to leave the Shire. And all of a sudden, there's these 13 dwarves. And they want to reclaim their ancestral home. It was taken from a dragon named Smaug. But you can't go on a quest with 13. It's an unlucky number. And there's this wizard named Gandalf. And he goes to Bilbo and he says, it's not right for these dwarves to go with 13. You need to be the 14th member, the lucky number. Bilbo doesn't want to go on a journey. And he gets co-opted into this thing. And he has to leave his home to help others reclaim theirs. First night he has to sleep on the hard ground. He's not too happy. He wishes he was back in his feathery bed, back in his hobbit hole. When his provisions get stale, he longs for the fresh food in his larder, back at the Shire. First time they face trouble is when they come upon the trolls, William, Bert, and Tom. This is Tolkien. He gives his characters names like Gladriel, Elrond, Aragorn. But his evil trolls, William, Bert, and Tom. But he's facing danger, and he longs for the safety, the relative safety of the Shire. 18 times in that book, he longs to go back to his home. And he's on a journey with people trying to recapture their ancestral home. The whole book is to awaken in us longing for home, the ultimate home. And when finally Bilbo, after being gone for a year, comes home, he comes over the hill of the Shire and he sees his home, and a poem just pops naturally right out of his mouth. Roads go ever on, over rock and under tree, by caves where never sun has shone, by streams that never find the sea, over snow by winter sown, and through the merry flowers of June, over grass and over stone, and under mountains in the moon. Roads go ever on, under cloud and under star, yet feet that wandering have gone turn at last to home afar. Eyes that fire and sword have seen, and horse on meadows green, and trees and hills that long have known. Does that sound vaguely familiar? You're in the honors program. You've read the Odyssey. When Bilbo gets home, is it the same? No, the Sackville-Bagginses have declared him dead. They're dividing up the stuff. And he demands it back, and they declare him an imposter, and they won't give it back. And it's not what he's been dreaming about. That's not the home. If you've read the Odyssey, Ulysses has been off fighting against the Trojans. Takes him forever to get back. All the adventures. He just wants to go home to Ithaca to his wife Penelope. And when he gets back, what happens? He's found the suitors there. It's not the same. He has to do business with these people. Here's Ulysses writing something. Tolkien picks up on it, embellishes it, and uses it as an awakening of spiritual aspiration at its highest level. Let me see if I can give you another example. My oldest son, Jeremy, had just turned 40 this summer. And Jeremy, when he was a boy, if there was a play at Wheaton College and they needed a child in it, he would be asked to come and audition. So they were doing the adaptation of Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, and he was asked to audition for young Pip, and young Pip has the majority of the lines for the first third of the play. He's living the life of a college student as a 10-year-old boy. He was loving it. If we couldn't find him at home, we'd go up the dorm. He'd be in one of the dorm rooms with one of his dorm buddies, you know, with their earphones on, just sort of rocking out to their music. He's living this life for 2.5 months, going to rehearsals night after night. The performances were 14 every night of the week for 6 days, a matinee on Saturday, 2 weeks, 14 plays, 14 productions, and now he's finished his last one. This is a world he's come to love. And I go to pick him up after his last night. He's changed back into his street clothes. We go walking through the Arena Theater at Wheaton College. And it's the first time in his life he's discovered that the students don't leave the set until they've dismantled the set. And he's seen the world that he's come to love just being destroyed. He said, Dad, I've got to sit down. You look like Obi-Wan Kenobi when that planet blew up and he knew there was a disturbance in the Force. And he just sat there meditatively. Finally I said, come on, Jeremy, we've got to go. And he shuffles out to the car like an old man. And when we get to the car, he said, Dad, I just didn't want it to end. I said, oh, but Jeremy, it's the nature of every play that has to come to an end. It's the nature of every holiday and every vacation that has to come to an end. It's the nature of every year in school. It's going to come to an end. As a matter of fact, it's the nature of your own childhood. It's going to come to an end. Maybe what you're really longing for is the one thing that never has to end. And he looks at me and he says, do you mean heaven, Dad? I said, yeah, heaven. So Tolkien wants to produce fantasy, as does Lewis, that awakens longing and sets us on a quest, a pilgrim quest, Okay? And then third, or second, we see the second thing is recovery. Recovery. And Tolkien says recovery is the regaining of a clear view. I do not say seeing things as they are and involve myself with the philosophers, though I might venture to say seeing things as we are, or we were meant to see them, as things apart from ourselves. Our tendency is to acquire and to hoard, to trivialize that which is familiar. And we need to have reawakened in us the wonder of the world that we find ourselves in. In George MacDonald's introduction to The Princess and the Goblin, and you got to get the original because a lot of the Christian elements have been edited out. But in the original of this story, he begins to tell a story and he's interrupted. And I want to give you the two voices. Narrator. There once was a little princess who, interrupting voice, but Mr. Narrator, why do you always write about princesses? Narrator. Well, because every little girl is a princess. Interrupting voice. Oh, you'll make them vain if you tell them that. Narrator. Not if they understand what I mean. Interrupting voice. Then what do you mean by a princess? Narrator. What do you mean by a princess? Interrupting voice. I mean the daughter of a king. Narrator. Very well then. Every little girl is a princess. And she's always in trouble of forgetting her rank and acting as if she grew up in the mud. And that's why little girls need to have stories to remind them that they are princesses. The recovery, the recognition, as Lewis says, there are no ordinary people. You've never met a mere mortal. You get it in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Remember that great book, how it starts? There once was a boy named Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. And Clive Staples Lewis knew nobody deserved to be named Clive Staples Lewis. But Eustace Clarence Scrubb has the heart of a dragon under the skin of a little boy. And in the magic of Narnia, he ends up turning externally into what he's always been internally. He is trouble from the get-go on the Narnian voyage. They have a major storm. The ship's mast is broken. It needs to be revictualed. They need water for the cistern. When they come ashore, everybody needs to work, but not Eustace. He won't do this, and so he goes wandering off. He comes upon a dragon's lair, had no clue what he had stumbled on because Lewis said he never read the right kinds of books in his school. And he sees this dragon die in front of him, and he puts an armband up on his arm. And then he looks in the pond, and to his horror, he sees a dragon hovering over him. He's got to escape, so he moves his right hand, and the dragon moves his right arm. He moves his left arm, and the dragon moves his left arm, and Eustace discovers he has become dragon. Lewis uses the image of the mirror, the pool of water, in many of his books to show this sort of sense of self-awareness begin to emerge and reveal the truth about each of us. Eustace, brokenhearted now, seeing things as they are, recovery. He goes back to the Dawn Treader. They're afraid of him at first, but then Reepicheep notices he's weeping. The dragon's weeping. He goes running up to him to comfort him. But also in his dragon state, Eustace is able to help them. They need a mast. He goes to a tree, knocks off all the branches with his claws. With his hot breath, burns off the bark, knocks down the branch or tree, sticks it in place. So they've got a new mast. He flies over the island and he gets mountain goats and different animals to revictual the ship. Not only that, he flies over the island and he's able to see ponds and he's able to help them get fresh water. And they're all ready to go. But what do they do with Eustace's dragon? They wonder. They go to sleep that night. And in the gray dawn moments of the next morning, only one member of the Dawn Treader is awake as Reepicheep, recovered, a little boy, comes back with the heart of a boy and the skin of a boy. And he tells his story to this one member of the Dawn Treader. He says, I went back to the pond that night, and there was a lion there. I was bigger than a lion, but I was afraid. And the lion said to me, you must undress yourself. And I thought, oh yeah, dragons are like lizards and snakes, scaly things. Maybe I could just shed my skin and be boy again. Tremendous effort, I shed my skin. I looked in the pond, and I was still dragon. A second time, I shed my skin and was still dragon. A third time, frustrated, he looked in the pond and still he was dragon. And he said, the lion said to me, I must undress you. And taking that lion claw, he dug through that dragon flesh all the way to that dragon heart and made him boy again. And who was it that was waiting for him in those gray dawn hours? It wasn't Reepicheep. It was Edmund, the one Aslan had to die for to set free, the one he had to recover and undragon in a sense in the first of the Narnian books, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And he now becomes the father confessor for the next one, and it gets passed on. And Rilian's brought back, Eustace is brought back to rescue Rilian in the silver chair. There's recovery. The next one is escape. He says it's not the escape of the deserter that he's writing about, but the escape of the prisoner who recognizes they're confined, maybe in worldviews that have come down to us. I can just say this. If you finish the sentence. Matter is neither created nor destroyed. Look how we just say it. We heard it in junior high, middle school. Some teacher who probably never thought critically about the phrase themselves didn't realize they were just passing on a materialist presupposition. It's not proved. But we bought it. We bought all kinds of things in our culture. And a fairy story helps us to see with new eyes and escape and recover. Escape from the materialism of our day. The last one, I want to give you an illustration about escape, but I don't know if we have enough time. So I'm just going to move on to the last one and then a story. And the last one is what Tolkien calls consolation or eucatastrophe. The characteristic of the fairy story is the happy ending, consolation. You can have the fall, but you can also have the consolation as the incarnation. You can have the crucifixion, but the consolation is the resurrection. That there comes the ending that is the happy ending. That we see it works out all right, which is a reminder of ultimate recovery, ultimate escape, ultimate consolation. The joy of the happy ending is something that's true to the very way the universe is as God made it. So let me give you a quick story, and then we'll end it with that, okay? Unless you have some questions. In reading Lewis, I like to read the books that he refers to, and one of the great stories that I have read is Chaucer's Troilus and Cressida. Chaucer's telling of the story of Troilus and Cressida is light years better than Shakespeare's telling of the story. You disagree, you think Shakespeare's better? But he makes Cressida seem flawed from the beginning. Whereas Chaucer makes her seem like she's a victim of circumstance more than flawed. But how can I argue with your English professor? Huh?
Carry on.
Carry on. But I've just discredited myself completely, right? All right, but let me tell the story from Chaucer's perspective. Chaucer begins the story by asking the reader to pray for him, that he'll tell the story well. He also asks the reader to pray for those who have never been in love, that they might know love. He asks the reader to pray for those who have longed to be loved, but have found all their circumstances are unrequited. He asks for the reader to pray for those who were once in love and have fallen out of love, that their love might be restored. And he asks the reader to pray that those who are in love would remain in love. And then he tells the story. The story is set in Troy. Troilus is the brother of Hector, the crown prince. And Troilus is concerned about this war with the Greeks. And the soldiers go out, led by the cavalry, and led by the foot soldiers follow. And every day they go out and fight in the battle, 8 to 5. They go out and do battle with the Greeks, and they come back at the end of the day. And the people of Troy line the streets and cheer for their heroes as they go out to battle. And they line the streets as they come back, cheering for them, but also watching. Is there a horse that's come back riderless? Is there a soldier missing in the ranks? And Troilus is serious about this. But in the evening, he's got a lot of his friends who are at the cafes, and they're trying to court the young women, and they're he thinks, involved in frivolous stuff. They should be more thinking about the war that's before them. And he is on them like a junior high boy on his friend when his friend starts to like girls. And he's merciless, and he's just a chump. And he's ragging on these guys constantly until the day when he's riding out to battle and he just happens to notice one woman in the crowd. This is my wife Claudia there, see? One woman in the crowd. And he thinks, who's she? And he goes out to battle. He comes back, he sits up in his saddle, and he's scanning everywhere till he finds her. And when he finds her, he can't take his eyes off her. But he can't ask about her either. Because if he asks, he'll get back what he's been giving out for all these months. And so he tries to find out who it is, and he finds out it's Cressida, the daughter of Calchas, the high priest. He knows her maternal uncle, Pander. But just about this time, Calchas, her father, becomes the Benedict Arnold of Troy and sells the secrets to the Greeks and the Trojans. And then everybody watches Cressida to see if she's going to be like her father. Does the acorn fall close to the tree? But instead, with all the scrutiny, she proves to be a woman of excellence. And all of a sudden, he falls more in love with her than before. He longs to have time with her, but how does he arrange it? He goes to Pander. He says, Pander, you got to have a dinner party. Invite your niece. I gotta spend time with her. He can't talk to anybody else about it. Pander doesn't want to do it. He doesn't think she would come. He badgers her and badgers her. Finally, he invites her to the dinner, but now Troilus doesn't know what to do. He's just a total doofus around women. And he comes to the dinner party, and he just messes up everything. It's just awkward, confusing. It's just it's a failure of an evening. And Troilus is just beside himself. He needs to spend time with her. He goes to Pander. Pander, you got to do it again. Pander says, I'll never get her to come back. You were such a doofus. I think that's an old Greek word, isn't it? Doofus. I think it's in the accusative form or something like that. Anyway, he finally badgers her, and Pander brings her back, and it goes a little better, but still not perfect. He brings her back again, and all of a sudden the sparks start to fly. And then pretty soon this romance develops, and they fall deeply in love with each other. And then the word comes that the Trojans want some of their heroes, their POWs, brought back. By this time, Calchas is able to express his concerns to the Greeks and says, I want my daughter. And so they barter Cressida for the Trojan heroes to return. And all of a sudden, Troilus and Cressida, who are deeply in love, are going to be ripped apart. They weep, knowing what's before them. They make plans. 3 months after she's gone, she's going to sneak away from the Greek camp. He's going to sneak out at night from Troy, and they're going to meet on a hilltop not far away and rekindle their love. They pull her away. By this time, Troilus is weeping, Cressida's weeping. All his friends realize he's had this love interest going on all along. He doesn't care. At night, when he comes in from battle, he saddles his horse. He rides around the city just to go to the places where he and Cressida have spent time and made memories together. He rereads with his tears falling on the pages, the letters, the love letters that he's received from her. And that's how he waits the 3 months until finally the day comes when he could be reunited with her. And he goes to that mountaintop, eager to see her. And she doesn't come. He waits and waits. And horrified, he begins to think, what if I, in my emotion of saying when we would meet, got the wrong day? What if she was here before and I wasn't here? And night after night, he goes back and spends the night on that mountaintop and goes back to the city and gets in the city before the morning breaks. And he becomes incautious on the battlefield. He hardly cares if he lives or dies. What happened back among the Greeks when Cressida got there? She just weeps. She doesn't want to talk to her father. She's furious at him. And she won't talk to anybody. And for a week, she cries every day. But there's a Greek hero named Diomed, and he sees her. And after seeing her cry for a week, he finally comes up after a week and says, tell me your sorrows. And by this time, she's just looking for somebody she can bare her soul to. And she tells him her sorrows. And the next night, he comes back and says, tell me your sorrows. And she tells him. And the next night, and the next night. And as she bears her soul to this man, she finds in time that she has fallen in love with him. And when the day comes for her to go back to the mountaintop, she doesn't show. The story gets back to Troilus. He's so incautious on the battlefield. There comes the day when he meets Diomed on the battlefield, and they fight, and the swords and the clanging of sword against armor, the sparks are flying. There's such bloodletting, they both survive, but barely. But following this, Troilus is so incautious on the battlefield, he's actually slain on the battlefield. Lewis writes about this in the Allegory of Love. But as Chaucer tells the story, his soul is elevated above his body. And he gains perspective on these things, and he gains perspective on the world. And finally, Chaucer ends his whole story that he began with prayer by another prayer. And it's this: Blessed Jesus, turn all our loves to thee. Blessed Jesus, turn our loves to thee. You want the ultimate happy ending? You got to push on towards the big portion. The big portion. And if the big portion is there, you can enjoy the small things as much as you want. It's Augustine's Ordo Amoris, ordered love. Put first things first. Lewis writes an essay called First and Second Things. Put first things first, you get second things thrown in. Put second things first, you lose out on first and second things. That's right. These are the kinds of things Lewis and Tolkien are trying to do as they write their stories. It wasn't a failed attempt at apologetics. They had an intention, a rhetorical intention, all along. We're supposed to go to 8:15. We got 5 minutes. Any questions? Yes. First name?
Kevin.
Kenneth?
Kevin.
Kevin?
Yes. In the beginning, you had mentioned something about reason and will, and you would suggest that C.S. Lewis potentially downplayed reason or
not at all.
Esteemed others at the exclusion of reason or anything like that.
No. He doesn't downplay it. He was a rational. When I say he's not an Enlightenment rationalist.
Right, but he's an
objectivist.
The hand and the heart all together. Right?
He is, but he sees in a fallen life, reason like any other parts of us, like the heart, like the will, can go afoul.
Of course.
And when reason goes afoul, if I make bad choices, it will begin to rationalize those choices. In the Nicomachean Ethics that Lewis quotes in the Abolition of Man, he footnotes this one passage in the Ethics where Aristotle says, vice is unconscious of itself.
I see. Lewis
himself wrote in his book, the preface to Paradise Lost, continued disobedience to conscience makes conscience blind.
Yes.
Or G.K. Chesterton says, vice demands a sort of virginity. Mm-hmm. Or Paul says, we suppress truth in our unrighteousness.
And Plantinga talks about noetic damage in our brains. And I mean, he doesn't have like a Humean reason is the slave of passion.
No. Well, reason can be co-opted by passion.
Yes. But
I can begin to rationalize a bad thing. But reason can triumph over passion, too.
Right.
Yeah. Is that fair?
Yes, sir.
Yes, way in the back. Shout it out because my ears are so bad. Your first name?
Johnny.
Johnny?
Yeah, if you could only read one book by C.S. C.S. Lewis for the rest of your life?
A compilation.
That's really bad. Yeah, I read the quotable C.S. Lewis, edited by Jerry Root.
Yeah.
Because it has selections from all of his books.
Yeah.
And they're well documented, so if you're going to write a paper and you need to quote Lewis, you will have no problem with the documentation.
Well, what's your favorite?
No, but here's the deal. I can't do that. You're asking me to tear my heart out. People say, what's your favorite Lewis book? I say, whichever one I'm reading at that time. There's 73. The least I've read any of them is 6 times. One of them I lost track after 60 times. And I don't just read Lewis. I read the books he refers to, too. Please understand that. But I'm old, so that I've had time. You haven't had time yet. But if you really twisted my arm and made me do this, I would probably say English literature in the 16th century excluding drama. And the reason why it's a 600-page book. There's a ton of stuff in there. And he opens a gazillion doors to all kinds of other literature. And he called it his Oh Hell volume. He wrote it for Oxford History of English Literature, Oh Hell. And it took him 18 years from the time he signed the contract till the book came out. It was a horrible burden for him. He read every book written in English in the 16th century.
No way.
Every book translated into English in the original language it was written, Italian, Old French, Latin, and in translation. So if he made a judgment about the translation, it would be fair-minded and informed. It's a prodigious work of scholarship. And the reason why I would suggest this one, and it's hilarious. The book, every other page, you have belly laughter. But the reason why I'd say that is because with that one book, you'd be getting a century of knowledge. And I think probably that's why I'd choose that one. Is that fair?
Yes. I was just saying it was one of the first books I read in grad school.
That was one of the first ones you read in grad school? I think the first one I read was like a Treasury Classic comic book. So anyway, that's right, Bill. We got time for one last question.
Way up.
I'm sorry? Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Shout it out because I can't hear very well.
You were mentioning before.
Tell me your name first.
Nathan.
Nathan.
Yes. You were mentioning before about how C.S. Lewis talks about the longings that literature steers within us, and how that can be a form of ethics from the standpoint from literature. And I wanted to ask, what do you think C.S. Lewis would define as bad literature or bad art?
So I couldn't hear it all very well. You asked about longing, and then
I asked, what do you think C.S. Lewis would have thought of would be bad literature or bad art? How would he define what is good kind of literature or good kind of art in that sense?
Well, Lewis he was an objectivist. Again, not a medieval, not an Enlightenment rationalist. He believed there were objects that are knowable and that there are knowers, subjects. Truth is not reality. Truth is what I think about reality when I think accurately about it. So he had a classical understanding of truth. A statement is true when it says what is, or what is not. There has to be something to support the truth claim. This is a pen true. And consequently, I can have a sure word about it, but I hold what I know about it with humility. Because every truth you know, you can still plumb it more deeply. You can see applications you never thought about at first. Truth is wonderful and awe-inspiring. Okay, so if he believes that about intellectual activity, what does he think about art and beauty? Can you be objective about that as well? I remember one time I said to my wife, I thought Picasso was an idiot. She said, really? What do you know about Picasso? I didn't know anything. She said, well, then we have to renegotiate who the idiot is. And then we have to see if the idiot is educable. So she took me to the Chicago Art Institute, and we saw a Picasso exhibit. She had taken a course on Picasso. She showed me all the stuff she knew because she had studied. And I go, oh my heavens, there's so much more there. One time we went to Barcelona, and we went to the Picasso Museum in Barcelona. Took my breath away. Lewis says, art is not just in the eyes of the beholder. There's something objective about beauty. It's admirable, whether I see it or not. And then you have the ability to admire and appreciate. That's the subjective side. That's enjoyable beauty. Admirable, objective, enjoyable, my capacity to appreciate. And if I don't see it, it doesn't mean it might not be there. Now, it's true, some people might say it's there and there's nothing there. But we have to have people who have studied these things. A lot of times we are so self-referential and so utilitarian in our judgments. We need recovery again so that we can see things as they are rather than how we would have to have them be. So what I need to do is try to enter into this discussion. If I had time, I could take you to Thomas Aquinas and show you how Lewis defines these things and how he enters into how you can make objective judgments about beauty, but also not just make it a head thing, make it a heart thing, and end up with the discovery of beauty, moving towards adoration, wonder, worship, and so on. Is that fair? And it awakens longing and sets my heart on a quest, and with that we end. Blessings.